Hello students, welcome to Read Med Prep Academy channel. Today in Classical Genetics Part 1, I am going to introduce you to genetics and we are going to talk about heredity and variation. What is genetics? Genetics is the study of how living things receive common traits from previous generations. No field of science has changed the world more in the past 50 years than genetics. The scientific and technological advances in genetics have transformed agriculture, medicine, and forensic sciences, etc. Genetics is the science of heredity or the science of inheritance. The term genetics was introduced by W. Bateson in 1906. Genetics is the branch of biological science which deals with the mechanism of transmission of characters from parents to offsprings. So what are the sub-disciplines of genetics? Number 1 is transmission genetics or classical genetics. Number 2 is molecular genetics. Number 3 is population genetics. Number 4 is quantitative genetics. What is transmission genetics or classical genetics? It deals with the transmission of genes from parents to the offspring. The foundation of classical genetics came from the study of hereditary behavior of 7 genes by Gregor Mendel. What is molecular genetics? It deals with the structure and function of a gene at the molecular level, like the structure of chromosome, the DNA, genes, coding and non-coding areas of the genes, etc. Now, what is population genetics? It deals with the heredity in groups of individuals for traits which is determined by a few genes. This is useful in evolution and distribution of genes in the population, relationship of genes with different characters and diseases in different populations. Now, what is quantitative genetics? It deals with heredity of traits in groups of individuals where the traits are governed by many genes simultaneously. Genes are the functional units of inheritance. The basic unit of heredity, it is a biological information storage which transmits biochemical, anatomical and behavioral traits from the parents to the offspring. The gene is the functional unit of heredity residing at a specific point along a chromosome. Conceptually, it is an information storage unit capable of undergoing replication, expression and mutation. It is a very complex element. Biochemically, a gene is a length of DNA that specifies a particular product like an enzyme or a protein and the action. Now, let us move on to heredity and variation. Genetics is often described as a science which deals with heredity and variation. Heredity is the transmission of characters from parents to the offspring. Here in this image you can see the parents and the passage of genetic instructions from one generation to the next generation. Now, what is variation? The organism belonging to the same natural population or species that shows a difference in the characteristics is called variation. Variation means different. We are all different due to special sequence of bases along our DNA. They are unique in every individual or a person. If you change the recipe of the food, the production of the food will change. Likewise, if you change the recipe of the cake, you change the taste of the cake. So what is the difference between heredity and variation? Heredity is the mechanism which transmits the characters, resemblances, as well as the differences to the offspring from the parents. Variation represents the visible differences shown by individuals within the offspring and species. Heredity is not responsible for the diversity within the population, whereas variation is responsible for the diversity within the population. Heredity has no influence on evolution, whereas variation leads to evolution by introducing new phenotypic characters to the species. Flat feet versus arches, attached versus free earlobes, flower color, seed type and genetic diseases are examples of heredity. Whereas examples of variation, eye color, skin color, hair color, dimples and freckles are examples. There are two types of variation: discontinuous variation and continuous variation. What is discontinuous variation? Within a population, there are some characteristics which show a limited form of variation. Example, the style length in primula, Another example, plant height of garden pea. Here you can see the style length in primula, a long thin pin like style on the left flower. On the right flower you can see a short thick style. Here you can see the plant height in a garden pea, the tall plant which is on the left side and a dwarf plant on the right side. In discontinuous variation, the characters are controlled by one or two major genes which may have two or more allelic forms. These variations are genetically determined by inheritance factors. Individuals produced by this variation, that is the discontinuous variation, show differences without any intermediate form between them, and there is no overlapping between the two phenotypes. The phenotypic expression is unaffected by the environmental conditions. This is also called qualitative inheritance. Now, what is continuous variation? This variation may be due to combining effects of environmental as well as genetic factors. In a population, most of the characteristics exhibit a complete gradation from one extreme to the other without any break. Inheritance of phenotype is determined by the combined effects of many genes. So many genes are involved in continuous inheritance and environmental factors. This is also known as quantitative inheritance. Example, human height and skin color. Here you can see the variation in the height. Each individual varies in his height and is different from each other in their height. Here you can see each individual is different in his skin color. What are the differences between continuous variation and discontinuous variation? The type of genetic variation which shows an unbroken range of phenotype of a particular character in the population is a continuous variation. Whereas in discontinuous variation, the type of genetic variation which shows two or more separate forms of a character in the population. Phenotypes have a continuous range and they are difficult to classify into specific categories. Phenotypes have a discontinuous range and they can be categorized easily in discontinuous variation. In continuous variation, intermediate groupings are present, whereas in discontinuous variation, intermediate groupings are absent. In continuous variation, it gives a smooth bell-shaped curve, whereas in discontinuous variation, does not give a curve. In continuous variation, the more common type of genetic variation is a continuous variation. The simplest form of genetic variation is the discontinuous variation. Many genes are present for the determination of a particular trait in a continuous variation, whereas in a discontinuous variation, one or few genes are present for the determination of a particular trait. In continuous variation, there is no one-to-one correspondence of genotype and phenotype. In a discontinuous variation, there is a predictable one-to-one relation between genotype and phenotype. The examples of continuous variation: weight, height and length of organisms. Whereas the examples of discontinuous variation, the color of the petals, the blood groups of animals, the gender of animals, etc. What is the importance of variation? Variations make some individuals better fitted in the struggle of existence. They help the individuals to adapt themselves to the changing environment. It provides the genetic material for the natural selection. Variations also allow the breeders to improve better yield of the product, quicker growth and increased resistance and lesser input. They constitute the raw materials for evolution. So today in Classical Genetics Part 1, we talked about the introduction to genetics and heredity and variation. Thank you. Kindly subscribe, like, share and comment the channel ReadMedPrep Academy. Log on to www.readmedprepacademy.com. Our Facebook ID is ReadMedPrep Academy. Our email is readmedprepacademy@gmail.com. Kindly post your questions in the comment box. We will reply with appropriate answers. Thank you very much.